Millions claim spiritual awakening, yet their lives remain trapped in familiar patterns of suffering, addiction, and destructive behavior. The paradox is glaring. If these experiences truly transform consciousness, why do so many awakened individuals continue struggling with the same demons they sought to transcend? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the depths of the human psyche, warned about this exact phenomenon over a century ago. He called it spiritual bypassing, the unconscious use of spiritual beliefs and practices to sidestep psychological wounds and avoid the difficult work of authentic transformation. Ethan's story illustrates this trap perfectly. His first taste of spiritual awakening arrived like a sudden sunrise behind a thundercloud, breaking through years of searching for transcendence from the ceaseless ache of modern life. He had scoured self-help books, attended weekend retreats, and prayed in silent groves, always sensing there was something more beyond the mundane struggles of daily existence. Then one afternoon, seated cross-legged on a cushion in his apartment, a ripple of warmth unfurled through his chest, and the walls between self and world dissolved. Colors glowed more intensely, air felt rich with electric possibility, and a quiet voice whispered, "You are part of something greater." In that moment, Ethan believed he had unlocked the door to the infinite. He emerged from that session electrified, certain he now held a key to unshakable peace. He began sharing mantras during work breaks, extolling meditation apps to colleagues, and plastering his apartment with affirmations, "I am light, love conquers all, everything is perfect as it is." Friends observed him talking about inner realms and cosmic unity, his eyes alight with newfound certainty. Yet beneath the euphoria lurked an unspoken question. If he already saw himself as pure light, what remained for the messy, painful, and challenging aspects of human existence? In the weeks that followed, Ethan chased repeated peaks of unity, subscribing to one guru's live stream, then another's silent retreat. He replaced sleep with midnight-seated meditations, convinced that fewer distractions would intensify his link to the divine. Yet each subsequent practice delivered diminishing returns. The vivid glow of initial awakening receded into background static, and the voice that once spoke clear guidance now echoed with vague spiritual cliches. Ethan began to wonder if he had tricked himself into a false enlightenment. In group circles, he watched peers leap from one teaching to another, swapping philosophies like clothes in search of the next realization, the next breakthrough. He realized they all responded to disappointment with the same ritual: sign up for a longer, more intensive retreat. One morning, Ethan awoke to a loop of anxious thoughts that he had assumed disappeared forever. Worries about finances, fear of rejection, lingering resentment toward his estranged brother. He tried to override these intrusions with breathwork and positive affirmations, but the difficult emotions poured over their edges like water over a dam. When he sat still, his body hummed with restless tension that no amount of spiritual practice seemed to touch. The transcendent fields he thought he inhabited turned out to be no buffer against the old storms within. He felt more adrift and uncertain than before his awakening. For example, during a weekend intensive focused on dissolving the ego, Ethan had assumed that the dense silence and chanting would shield him from his personal grief. Yet in the darkness of a guided exercise, images of childhood hurt emerged with startling clarity. A parent's cold dismissal, a friend's betrayal, moments of shame he had buried for decades. Instead of dissolving into pure light, his grief coalesced into a mass of pain, as if the spiritual container only magnified what he was trying to escape. He left the session shaken and guilt-ridden, convinced he had failed at the very awakening he had so fervently pursued. Over time, Ethan recognized a disturbing pattern. His spiritual practices had become sophisticated escape routes from everyday life. When work problems loomed or relationship tensions flared, he defaulted to silent retreats and mantra loops rather than direct engagement. In professional meetings, he would excuse himself for midday mindfulness, avoiding confrontation with conflict. When friends invited him for coffee to share their struggles, he declined, citing a need for inner work. Convinced that detachment equaled spiritual growth, he systematically cut connections that felt messy or emotionally demanding. Yet, solitude only amplified his loneliness and disconnection from the world he claimed to love unconditionally. The turning point came when a concerned colleague reached out after Ethan vanished for 2 weeks to a remote meditation center without notice. Worried about his well-being, she asked if he was safe and whether something was wrong. Ethan's response was defensively spiritual. He argued that true awakening required disruption of ordinary routines and that her concern reflected attachment to Maya, the illusion of separation. Yet as these words left his mouth, he sensed a hollow ring in his own convictions. He realized he was more interested in talking about enlightenment than practicing simple human kindness. A pang of shame pierced his spiritual armor. Rather than cultivating compassion, he had used spiritual language to evade his own wounds and dismiss others' care. In that moment of recognition, Ethan confronted a hidden truth that Jung had warned about. Awakening experiences, no matter how profound, cannot override the necessity of psychological work. He saw that without facing his shadow, the repository of unresolved emotions, unconscious patterns, and disowned aspects of personality, his spiritual euphoria amounted to little more than an elaborate bypass around his humanity. He recalled Jung's insight that spiritual illumination which refuses to engage the dark corners of the soul risks becoming nothing more than a hollow performance of radiance, leaving the person fundamentally unchanged beneath the surface glow. From that sobering realization sprang a new intention, to embark on a journey that honored both the light glimpsed in awakening and the darkness he had long ignored. Rather than choosing between spirituality and psychology, he would integrate them. This meant facing the uncomfortable truth that authentic transformation required descending into his personal underworld before any genuine transcendence could occur. Carl Jung mapped the journey of personal transformation through a process he called individuation, which unfolds in distinct but interwoven stages. This map illustrates how spiritual awakening, when pursued without integrating the shadow, can lead to an incomplete, unstable sense of self. True awakening, Jung insisted, requires traversing the depths of the unconscious, reconciling opposites, and becoming a whole person rather than escaping into idealized states of consciousness. The first stage of individuation begins with the confrontation with the persona, the mask that individuals present to the world. In Ethan's case, his early spiritual pursuits offered a new persona, the enlightened guru, detached from ordinary concerns. He wore this mask proudly, posting spiritual quotes online, offering unsolicited guidance, and cultivating an aura of otherworldly calm. However, Jung warned that any persona, including the spiritual avatar, carries the risk of becoming rigid and tyrannical if unexamined. When the mask hardens, the unconscious contents it excludes gain strength, driving compulsions and projections under the surface. In the second stage, the shadow emerges as the dark companion of the persona. The shadow contains all those repressed or denied elements, emotions, desires, memories that conflict with the conscious image. As Ethan's spiritual self rose, his shadow swelled with unacknowledged grief, shame, and anxiety. In dream fragments and covert resistances, this shadow tormented him until he could no longer ignore its calls. Jung taught that encountering the shadow is often frightening. One must face qualities one hates or fears in oneself. Yet the integration of the shadow is crucial, otherwise it sabotages growth through spiritual bypass, convincing seekers they are above human frailty. Once the shadow is recognized and begins to reveal its contents, the third stage involves the encounter with the anima or animus, Jung's term for the inner opposite gender figure. In men, the anima embodies qualities stereotypically labeled feminine: intuition, emotional attunement, and receptivity. In women, the animus represents logical reasoning, assertiveness, and clarity. When spiritual seekers like Ethan overlook these qualities, they stunt their development by denying half of their psyche. His hunger for unity had opened a window to the anima's presence, yet he mistook it for a general cosmic oneness rather than the intimate whisper of his own neglected feelings. During this stage, individuals often experience inner dialogues and symbolic encounters, such as dreams featuring figures of the opposite gender. For Ethan, dreams of a compassionate woman beckoning him into deeper self-reflection signaled the anima's call. Jung encouraged active engagement with these figures through imagination and journaling, asking the dreamer to converse with them as if they were living beings. Such dialogues bridge the gap between conscious will and unconscious wisdom, guiding the seeker beyond abstract spirituality into personal transformation. The fourth stage of individuation culminates in the union of opposites, a harmonious synthesis of conscious and unconscious forces. Far from a single moment of enlightenment, this union represents a lifelong process of balance. Spiritual experiences become integrated when they inform everyday life, decisions grounded in both insight and practical wisdom, emotional depth balanced with mental clarity, and ethical values enacted through compassionate action. Only then does the initial awakening flash evolve into a stable flame, illuminating the whole personality. For example, after recognizing his spiritual persona's limitations, Ethan learned to revisit mundane challenges, relationship conflicts, career setbacks, and personal doubts as vital arenas for transformation. He realized that the true test of spiritual insight lay not in peak experiences, but in the resilience and authenticity demonstrated in daily interactions. Jung emphasized that individuation never ends. It involves continual renegotiation of the self's many facets. Even as one integrates the shadow and anima, new layers of unconscious material appear, calling for fresh attention and creativity. This dynamic interplay guards against complacency and guarantees that spirituality remains a living, evolving practice rather than a static ideology. By charting these stages, persona, shadow, anima, animus, and the union of opposites, Jung provided a roadmap for genuine transformation. Spiritual seekers who neglect any stage risk bypassing vital growth, settling instead for partial awakenings that leave deep inner wounds unattended. In contrast, those who embrace the full terrain, including its darkness and complexity, emerge with a more resilient, compassionate, and authentically awakened self. After glimpsing Jung's stages of true individuation, Ethan faced the most tempting detour: spiritual bypassing. This trap lures seekers with the promise of instantaneous transcendence, urging them to slip past inner conflicts and emotional wounds by embracing elevated spiritual identities. Yet bypassing only deepens the divide between conscious intentions and unconscious pain, weaving a gilded cage of pseudo-awakening. Spiritual bypass often begins innocently. During his early practice, Ethan noticed that certain painful emotions, fear, anger, grief, felt incongruent with his new spiritual persona. He reasoned that love and light should dissolve all negativity, so whenever uncomfortable feelings surfaced, he dutifully recited affirmations to transmute them. At first, this approach seemed effective. Anxiety quieted under layers of soothing mantras, and he felt justified in avoiding the complexity of human suffering. However, the unacknowledged emotions merely retreated into hidden corners of his psyche, gathering strength and coloring his behavior in subtle but disruptive ways. One hallmark of spiritual bypass is the insistence that certain feelings are lower vibrations that must be eliminated rather than explored. For example, when Ethan felt rage at a co-worker's insensitivity, he automatically labeled the anger as negative energy and mentally dissolved it with a visualization of white light. While this ritual temporarily masked the anger, it did nothing to address its source, a deep-seated fear of abandonment dating back to his childhood. Without confronting that fear directly, his momentary calm proved fragile, vanishing as soon as the next stressor appeared. Another pitfall is the overemphasis on spiritual experiences, visions, blissful states, or downloads. As evidence of progress, Ethan began to chase peak states, bookmarking each euphoric moment as proof of growth. He compared notes with fellow seekers, measuring his awakening against their anecdotes of visions and divine encounters. In doing so, he inadvertently entered a competitive cycle. The more extraordinary the experience, the more advanced the supposed practitioner. Yet as his focus shifted toward the next transcendent high, his daily life suffered. Responsibilities piled up, personal relationships frayed, and the hollow pursuit of spiritual credentials masked his unresolved struggles. Isolation also marks bypassing. Genuine inner work demands honest conversations about pain, vulnerability, and moral shortcomings. However, Ethan viewed such revelations as weaknesses contradictory to his enlightened identity. He withdrew from friends who expressed doubts or shared personal crises, judging their suffering as incompatible with his ascended state. Group circles that once nurtured him became echo chambers where only spiritual triumphs were celebrated, while admissions of struggle were brushed aside or reframed as lesser awakenings. This selective solidarity fostered an illusion of unity, a community of the chosen, rather than authentic support networks where darkness could safely surface. For example, during a group retreat, facilitators encouraged sharing both light and shadow aspects, When one participant confessed to battling addiction, the circle touched on the spiritual principles of self-forgiveness, but quickly returned to guided sitting meditations focused on silent bliss. The addict's raw pain became a brief anecdote rather than the catalyst for deeper engagement. Here, bypass manifested in well-intentioned insistence on maintaining a positive atmosphere, sidestepping the therapeutic opportunity to explore the roots of suffering and foster genuine empathy. Jung's warning resonates deeply here. When spiritual teachings neglect the shadow, they inadvertently reinforce it. In bypass, individuals project their disowned aspects onto others, judging those who display human vulnerability as insufficiently evolved. Ethan saw this dynamic clearly when, after confessing his own loneliness, a senior teacher gently suggested he wasn't ready for more advanced practices until he lifted his vibration. The message was clear: vulnerability equaled failure. Such guidance, cloaked in spiritual authority, reinforced the very patterns Jung cautioned against. Moreover, bypass fosters a form of magical thinking, the belief that spiritual techniques alone can replace personal responsibility. Ethan began to view his meditation cushion as a cure-all: sit long enough, and all challenges would be resolved. He prioritized sitting schedules over therapy appointments, mantra recitations over tough conversations with loved ones. This misplaced faith in the cushion echoed Jung's critique of any method claiming exclusivity in healing. Psychological growth requires a multifaceted approach, not blind adherence to a single tool. The consequences of bypass extend beyond the individual. When public figures promote bypassing as true awakening, they shape cultural attitudes about mental health and personal growth. Social media feeds brim with blissered-out posts showcasing ethereal sunsets and smiling gurus. Yet the unseen suffering beneath these curated images continues unabated. Followers adopt the gloss of spiritual perfection, shaming themselves when life's inevitable messiness erupts. Communities fragment into camps preaching immediate transcendence or advocating endless psychological analysis, rarely bridging the essential integration between inner and outer work. Breaking free from bypass demands acknowledging the fundamental paradox: spiritual practice can only flourish when anchored in authentic self-examination. Jung insisted that light and shadow are two sides of the same coin. True transformation involves honoring both. To dismantle bypass, seekers must embrace discomfort as an ally rather than an enemy. This begins with honest self-inquiry. What emotions do I habitually avoid? Which patterns of behavior feel unacceptable? By directly naming and exploring these vulnerabilities, spiritual practitioners weave connection between the heights of awakening and the depths of the psyche. Ethan's personal shift away from bypass involved radical honesty. He committed to weekly check-ins with a therapist specializing in Jungian analysis, bringing his troubling dreams and spiritual experiences to the couch rather than silencing them with affirmations. He opened dialogues with friends and family about his patterns of avoidance, inviting feedback without defensiveness. In group settings, he began voicing challenges openly, modeling for peers that struggle is not antithetical to awakening, but integral to it. Such steps embody Jung's imperative to let the darkness speak. In this light, spiritual bypass appears not as an innocent detour, but as a poignant warning that shortcuts in self-realization often lead to dead ends. By confronting the pitfalls of bypass, denial of feelings, fixation on experiences, isolation, magical thinking, individuals can reclaim the integrity of their spiritual path. Only by integrating both shadow and light can awakening become a lasting transformation rather than a fleeting escape. The distinguishing line between true spiritual integration and escapism lies in the depth and authenticity of internal work. While the allure of shedding pain through spiritual elevation tempts many, Jung's insights reveal that bypassing one's shadow with spiritual gloss leads only to superficial progress and eventual stagnation. Genuine integration demands courage to confront the complexity of human nature with honesty rather than flee into sanitized states of bliss or self-righteousness. Escapism often takes the form of excessive dissociation, mental fragmentation wherein uncomfortable feelings are pushed away or neutralized through spiritual rhetoric and practices. Ethan's early strategy of overriding anger with affirmations exemplifies such avoidance. While calming temporarily, it skirted the necessary engagement with underlying emotional material, Consequently, suppressed tensions accumulated, undermining spiritual clarity with waves of unresolved trauma and latent anxiety. Moreover, escapism manifests in a skewed spiritual narcissism, an inflated identity centered on perceived enlightenment or spiritual superiority. Ethan observed this as a race to the top dynamic among peers, where comparison fueled a sense of elitism and detachment from authentic vulnerability. This posture not only alienates others, but erodes self-compassion, as setbacks are interpreted as personal failures rather than integral parts of growth. True integration, conversely, embodies synthesis of opposites, light and shadow, spirit and flesh, introspection and action. To integrate spiritually means to embrace dark emotions as well as transcendent insights, allowing each to inform and temper the other. This approach extends beyond intellectual understanding to a lived, embodied experience. For instance, allowing oneself to feel grief or anger doesn't negate spiritual growth, but deepens its roots, fostering resilience rather than fragility. For example, Ethan began to notice moments when spiritual ideals clashed with lived realities, the frustration of unmet expectations, the sting of interpersonal conflict, even mundane challenges such as exhaustion. Instead of seeking immediate refuge in meditation or mantra, he practiced embracing contradiction, sitting with discomfort and reflecting on its messages. This practice gradually dissolved the sharp edges of bypass, opening space for complexity rather than simple dichotomies. Jungian psychology suggests that integration unfolds in iterative cycles rather than linear stages. One revisits shadow material repeatedly, each time perceiving it anew and integrating previously inaccessible aspects. This cyclical process demands patience and a stance of curious openness rather than judgment. The fallibility and imperfection exposed by such cycles are not weaknesses, but gateways to deeper wholeness. Physical embodiment plays a vital role in anchoring integration. Overemphasis on ethereal experiences without bodily grounding risks detachment, a hallmark of escapism. Conscious attention to breath, posture, and somatic sensations connects inner work to the lived body, making spiritual insights tangible. Practices like yoga, tai chi, or mindful walking cultivate this embodied awareness, harmonizing emotional and spiritual realms. Community connection is equally essential. While individual work matters deeply, isolation can entrench escapist tendencies. Ethan found that groups valuing transparency and mutual support challenged the temptation towards spiritual elitism and denial. Sharing struggles in safe spaces nurtures authenticity and creates feedback loops that correct illusions and reinforce healing. Furthermore, integration requires engaging with ethical dimensions. Spiritual awakening devoid of ethical responsibility risks solipsism and self-indulgence. Jung emphasized that true consciousness expresses through deeds that benefit others, guided by compassion and humility. This shift from self-centered striving toward relational and societal care marks a crucial transition beyond bypass. Common spiritual pitfalls such as over-reliance on ecstatic experiences, compulsive questing, and rejection of professional help can derail integration. For example, Ethan initially dismissed therapy, viewing it as incompatible with his spiritual path. Eventually, he embraced psychological support as a complement, enriching his inner journey with tools for emotional resilience and insight. By contrasting escapism and integration, it becomes evident that spiritual growth is neither quick nor painless. It requires walking through discomfort, embracing paradoxes, and committing to holistic self-inquiry. Rather than a task to complete, it is an art to practice, weaving together mind, body, and spirit into a unified fabric. As Ethan's journey deepened, he discovered that real spirituality does not mean perfection or detachment from life's shadows. Instead, it means dwelling within the fullness of existence, bearing the light and dark with equal openness, and moving intentionally toward a more authentic self, one that can face suffering without fleeing and love without conditions. Authentic spiritual growth can only be sustained by grounded practices that embrace the totality of human experience, minds, bodies, and relationships, instead of escaping them. After facing the pitfalls of spiritual bypass and understanding the cycles of true individuation, Ethan focused on cultivating a set of practical, embodied habits that could anchor his awakening in daily life. These grounded practices helped him move beyond the allure of fleeting transcendental states into authentic transformation. First among these practices is mindfulness grounded in the body. rather than seeking constant states of bliss. Ethan learned to attend carefully to bodily sensations, a tightness in the chest, a flutter of anxiety, or the gentle rise and fall of breath. Mindfulness in this sense is not an abstract observing detached from reality, but an intimate presence with sensation. For example, on mornings when restlessness stirred, Ethan would spend 10 minutes sitting quietly, noticing impulses to resist discomfort and deliberately allowing sensations to be felt fully without judgment. Through this, emotional turbulence lost its grip as a vague threat and became instead a known companion. Second, the cultivation of ritual and routine proved essential. Jung emphasized that individuation happens within the fabric of everyday life, not apart from it. Ethan incorporated simple rituals, lighting a candle before meditation, taking daily walks in nature, or journaling reflections while sipping tea, that created structure and invited reflection. These actions tethered his spiritual insights to concrete experience, bridging inner and outer worlds. Rituals functioned as portals, reminding him that transformation is a lived, embodied process instead of an escape into ephemeral states. Another cornerstone involved fostering authentic community connections rooted in vulnerability and mutual support. Ethan once isolated himself in pursuit of solitary enlightenment, but he soon realized that healing thrives in relational contexts. He joined discussion groups where members shared struggles and cultivated honest dialogue. In such safe spaces, contrasts between spiritual ideals and imperfect realities could be aired without shame. For example, hearing others speak openly about doubts and setbacks helped Ethan normalize his own fallibility, transforming shame into a shared human story. Creative expression became a vital outlet for integrating unconscious material. When words failed, Ethan painted abstract shapes bursting unpredictably with color, textures revealing grief, longing, or joy that verbal language could not capture. In dance classes, he experimented with spontaneous movement, discovering how embodied creativity unlocked wells of feeling trapped beneath the conscious mind. Art transformed the shadow from a vague force into living expression, inviting respect rather than avoidance. Additionally, Ethan embraced the power of ethical commitment, aligning spiritual awakening with acts of care, justice, and responsibility. Jung highlighted that true selfhood shows itself in ethical relation, and Ethan's growth flourished as daily choices embodied compassion rather than self-indulgence. Whether helping a neighbor, listening patiently to a friend, or consciously reducing harm in his consumption, Ethan's awakening expanded beyond inner light into outward impact. He also faced his shadows head-on by seeking therapeutic support, blending psychological insights with spiritual awareness. Therapy offered a space to explore childhood wounds, unconscious patterns, and resistance to change beyond the surface of spiritual teachings. It provided tools for navigating the more challenging emotional terrains that bypass could not reach. This synthesis, the meeting of depth psychology and spiritual practice, proved indispensable for sustainably weaving light and shadow. Importantly, Ethan recognized that setbacks and regressions were natural, not failures. Individuation is a cyclical dance rather than a linear climb. Each revisit to old patterns deepened his understanding and dissolved prior layers of denial. Patience and self-compassion became necessary companions alongside discipline. This acceptance of imperfection allowed Ethan to move through difficult phases without abandoning his practice or falling prey to spiritual grandiosity. Finally, Ethan integrated service as a living expression of transformation. Volunteering, mentoring, and community engagement grounded his insights in concrete, communal contexts. Serving others became a mirror reflecting his own vulnerabilities and strengths, fostering humility and interconnectedness. This outward engagement balanced inner work with social responsibility, fulfilling Jung's vision of holistic individuation. These grounded practices form a weaving of mindful presence, ritual, community, creativity, ethics, therapy, patience, and service. Their integration transforms awakening from a fragile peak experience into a durable, radiant way of being. Ethan's journey illustrates that spiritual awakening, when anchored in these authentic practices, transcends illusion and touches the core of human wholeness. It invites all seekers to step beyond the seductions of bypass and embrace the full, messy, beautiful complexity of transformation.